At Christmas dinner, I noticed the way my ex-husband lifted his wine glass, slowly, deliberately, before looking straight at the man sitting beside me and saying, "So this is the janitor you traded your life for." I just smiled. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from." I've learned something about family that night, something I should have seen years ago. The dining room was exactly how I used to set it when we were still a family. Warm golden lights wrapped around the Christmas tree in the corner, reflecting softly against the polished oak table. The same table I had spent decades decorating for holidays, placing each plate just right, folding each napkin into neat little triangles, making sure everyone felt welcome. Tonight, everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The candles flickered gently between us, casting shadows that danced across familiar faces that no longer felt familiar at all. My children sat across from me, grown now, successful, confident, and strangely distant. Their laughter came easily, but not once had they looked at me with the warmth they used to. Not once. Beside me, Daniel sat quietly. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing expensive, nothing that would impress people like my ex. His hands rested calmly on his lap, fingers slightly rough from years of work most people at that table would never understand. A janitor. That's what they saw. That's all they chose to see. "Mom," my daughter Claire said, swirling her wine, her lips curling just slightly, "you never told us he worked in maintenance." Maintenance? She said it like it was something that needed to be softened, dressed up to be less embarrassing. I reached for my glass, keeping my movement steady. "It's honest work," I replied. My ex let out a short laugh. "Honest?" he repeated, leaning back in his chair like he had just been handed a line from a joke. "Come on, Linda. You used to host charity galas. Now you're bringing a janitor to Christmas dinner?" The word landed heavier the second time. Janitor. I felt it, not because of what it meant, but because of how easily they used it to measure a man's worth. I glanced at Daniel. He hadn't moved. Not even a flicker of discomfort crossed his face. If anything, there was something almost calm about him, like he had already decided none of this mattered. That quiet steadiness was one of the reasons I trusted him, one of the reasons I chose him. But my son, Mark, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, what exactly do you clean?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Offices? Schools? Or houses like this?" A couple of soft chuckles followed. Not loud. Not cruel in the obvious way, but enough. Enough to make it clear that I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being too sensitive, the way they used to accuse me of when I noticed things they didn't want to acknowledge. This was real. Every glance, every smirk, every carefully disguised insult. Daniel finally picked up his glass, taking a small sip of water, as if he hadn't heard a word. And somehow, that made it worse for them, because they wanted a reaction. They wanted him to shrink, to stumble, to prove them right. He didn't. My ex leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Daniel like he was trying to figure out what kind of man would sit so calmly while being dissected in front of an entire family. Then he said it. Clear. Sharp. Without hesitation. "He's trash." The word hung in the air longer than it should have. And then laughter. My children laughed. Not loudly. Not uncontrollably. But enough. Enough that something inside my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the small details in front of me. The edge of my plate, the way the candle wax had begun to melt unevenly, the faint reflection of the Christmas lights in my glass. Anything to keep my expression from breaking. Because, if I looked up, I wasn't sure I could stay as composed as I needed to be. Daniel set his glass down gently. No force. No anger. Just a soft, controlled movement. Then he smiled. Not a defensive smile. Not an awkward one. A calm, knowing smile. Like he had just heard something predictable. Something expected. Something that didn't surprise him at all. And, in that moment, I realized something none of them did. They thought they were in control of that table. They thought they understood exactly who they were sitting across from. They thought they were laughing at a man beneath them. But Daniel's smile, it didn't belong to someone beneath anyone. It belonged to someone who was waiting. And for the first time that night, I wasn't embarrassed. I was curious. The soft hum of Christmas music continued in the background, as if nothing had just happened. As if a man hadn't been called trash at the center of a family table. As if my children hadn't laughed. I adjusted my napkin slowly on my lap, smoothing it out with careful fingers. It was something I used to do years ago, small, controlled movements to keep myself composed when conversations turned uncomfortable. Only back then, I used to think discomfort was temporary. Something you could fix. Something you could talk through. Now, I understood better. Some things weren't accidents. They were choices. Across the table, Claire reached for the mashed potatoes, her bracelet clinking softly against the serving spoon. She avoided looking at me, her attention fixed on her plate, as if nothing unusual had happened. Mom always liked things simple, she said lightly, glancing at Daniel for a fraction of a second before looking away again. I guess that hasn't changed. Simple. Another word dressed up to sound harmless. Another way of saying less. I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Barely noticeable. Daniel shifted slightly beside me, reaching for the bread basket. His movements were unhurried, steady, as if he were sitting in a completely different room, one where respect wasn't something that needed to be defended. I watched his hands for a moment. Strong. Careful. The kind of hands that fix things instead of breaking them. Daniel, right? Mark said, leaning back in his chair, his tone casual but edged with something sharper underneath. How long have you been working in that field? There was a pause. Not long. Just enough to feel intentional. Daniel looked up, meeting Mark's eyes without any hesitation. Long enough, he said simply.
No explanation. No apology.
Just that. Mark smirked. Slightly, exchanging a glance with his father like they were sharing a private joke I wasn't invited to. Well, my ex added, cutting into his steak with slow precision, at least you're consistent. The knife pressed harder than necessary. The sound of it scraping against the plate was sharp in the quiet. I felt something shift in the air then. Not louder, not more aggressive, just heavier, like the weight of everything unsaid had started settling over the table. I glanced toward the Christmas tree. The lights blinked softly, red to gold to green, repeating the same quiet pattern over and over again. I used to love that pattern. It used to make the room feel alive. Now it just felt distant, like something I used to belong to. You know, my ex continued, dabbing the corner of his mouth with his napkin, I always imagined you'd end up with someone on your level. There it was again. Level. As if life were something you could measure with a ruler. As if people came with price tags. I tilted my head slightly, finally looking directly at him. And what level is that? I asked. My voice was calm. Too calm. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he smiled. That same practice smile I had seen at business dinners, charity events, every place where appearances mattered more than truth. You know exactly what I mean. I held his gaze for a second longer. Then I looked away. Because I did know. I had known for years. That was the problem. Claire cleared her throat softly, trying to redirect the conversation. So, Daniel, she said, forcing a polite tone this time. How did you two meet? There it was. The question that sounded innocent on the surface. But underneath it, curiosity, doubt, judgment. I could feel it. Daniel didn't answer right away. He glanced at me first. Just for a second. Like he was giving me the choice. Like he understood that this wasn't just a story. It was a line that, once crossed, couldn't be taken back. I gave a small nod. It was subtle, but he saw it. We met at a hospital, he said. That caught their attention. All of them. Even my ex paused mid-motion, his fork hovering just above his plate. A hospital? Claire repeated, her brows lifting. Slightly. I could see the assumptions forming already. Volunteer work. Cleaning staff. Something small. Something that would fit the version of Daniel they had already decided on. I folded my hands gently on the table. It was after my surgery, I said. Silence settled again. Different this time. Not mocking. Not amused. Just listening. I was there longer than expected. I continued. And most people visited once. Maybe twice. I didn't look at my children when I said that. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of landing exactly where it needs to. Daniel remained still beside me.
Steady.
Present. He was the only one who showed up every day, I said.
No emphasis.
No drama. Just a simple fact. The kind that doesn't need decoration. Claire shifted in her seat. Mark looked down at his plate. My ex didn't react at all. But I saw the slight tightening in his jaw. Just for a moment. And then it was gone. Well, he said, picking up his glass again, his tone lighter now, dismissive. That's admirable. Loyalty is important. He took a sip, set the glass down. But it doesn't exactly change what he is. There it was. Again. The need to define. To label. To reduce. I felt my fingers tighten slightly against each other under the table. Not out of anger. Not anymore. Out of something else.
Clarity.
Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't questioning what I was seeing. I wasn't wondering if I was being too sensitive. I wasn't trying to smooth things over. I was simply observing. And the more I observed, the clearer everything became. Daniel reached for his glass again.
Calm.
Unbothered. And when he smiled this time, it was the same smile as before. Quiet. Knowing. Patient. Like he was waiting for something to finish unfolding. And somehow, I had this strange feeling that this dinner wasn't going the way anyone at that table thought it was. Claire's questions still lingered in the air, even after I finished speaking. The kind of silence that follows when something simple lands a little too hard. I picked up my fork and gently pressed it into the edge of the turkey on my plate, though I had no real appetite. The food looked perfect, golden, carefully arranged, just like every Christmas dinner I had hosted for over 30 years. Back when this table felt like mine. Back when I wasn't being quietly measured. Across from me, Mark cleared his throat. Well, he said, forcing a small chuckle. That's nice. Really nice.
Nice.
That word again. It always came out when people didn't know what else to say, but didn't want to admit they were uncomfortable. Claire nodded quickly.
Yeah.
That's sweet, she added, though her eyes didn't quite match her words. They flickered toward Daniel again, scanning him, not as a person, but as something to figure out. To place. To categorize. I had seen that look before. Too many times. Daniel didn't react. He simply cut a small piece of bread, his movements steady, controlled, like everything around him was just background noise. And that seemed to bother them more than anything. My ex set his glass down again, a little harder this time. You visited her every day? He asked, looking directly at Daniel now. Not curious.
Testing.
Daniel met his gaze, without hesitation. Yes. Why? The question came out sharper than necessary. Not because he didn't understand, but because he didn't accept the answer he was expecting. Daniel paused for a brief second, not to search for words, but as if deciding how much to say.
Because she was alone, he replied.
That was it. No long explanation. No attempt to impress. Just the truth. Simple.
Direct.
Uncomfortable. For a moment, no one spoke. I could feel it shift again, that subtle tension that crept in whenever something didn't fit their version of reality. My ex leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. Well, he said, his tone lighter now, almost amused, some people get attached easily, I suppose. Attached. Like I was something fragile. Like Daniel was something misplaced. I placed my fork down gently. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just enough to feel the movement. I had just come out of surgery, I said, my voice calm. I could barely stand. I couldn't drive. I couldn't even open a jar without help. No one interrupted. They all had their lives. I continued, letting my gaze drift briefly across my children before returning to my plate. Work. Meetings. Trips. Important things. Still no response. But he showed up, I said softly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of the words was enough. Claire shifted in her seat again, this time more noticeably. Mom, it wasn't like that, she said quickly. We called. We checked in.
Checked in.
like I was a task on a list, something to be completed between meetings. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. You did. And I left it there. Because there are moments when explaining more doesn't bring clarity. It only gives people room to defend themselves. Mark picked up his glass, taking a longer sip this time. You could have told us you needed more help, he added, his tone a little tighter now. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for a second, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who would run into the kitchen on Christmas morning, still in pajamas, asking if he could open just one present early. But that boy wasn't sitting across from me anymore. I did, I said. Quiet. Simple. Final. His eyes dropped to the table. And just like that, the conversation shifted again. Not away from the tension, but deeper into it. My ex let out a small breath through his nose, like he was growing impatient with the direction things were going. Well, he said, straightening his posture, we're not here to revisit old misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. That word almost made me smile. Because there had never been any misunderstanding. Only things people chose not to see. He picked up his knife again, slicing into his food with careful precision. What matters is the present, he continued. And right now you're making choices that don't exactly reflect the life you built. There it was again. The life you built. As if I had stepped outside of something I no longer deserved. As if choosing differently was the same as losing everything. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I simply observed. The way Claire avoided eye contact. The way Mark kept adjusting his glass. The way my ex controlled the rhythm of the conversation, steering it back to where he felt comfortable. And then I looked at Daniel. Still calm. Still composed. Still unaffected. He wasn't shrinking. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just there. Present in a way none of them were. And that's when I started to understand something. This wasn't just about him. It never was. It was about what he represented. A choice they didn't approve of. A life they couldn't control. A version of me that no longer fit into the image they had built. Claire suddenly smiled, a little too brightly. So, Daniel, she said, clearly trying to lighten the mood again. Do you enjoy your work? The question sounded polite. But underneath it, the same quiet judgment. The same need to define him. To keep him in a box that made sense to them. Daniel looked at her. Then he smiled again. That same calm, steady smile. Yes, he said. Claire blinked slightly, as if she had expected something more. Something to work with. Something to twist. But he didn't give it to her. And for a moment, just a brief moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. Because the script they were following wasn't working the way they thought it would. And as I sat there, watching it all unfold, I realized something had changed. Not at the table. Not in them. In me. I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I wasn't trying to fit back into something that had already let me go. I was simply sitting in the truth. And the truth was, this dinner wasn't exposing Daniel. It was exposing them. The room felt quieter after that. Not because anyone had stopped talking, but because something underneath the conversation had shifted. Something subtle, but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. I reached for my glass again, letting the cool surface rest against my fingertips before taking a small sip. The wine tasted the same as it always did, dry, familiar, but it didn't settle the way it used to. Across the table, my ex-husband adjusted his cufflinks, a habit he had never lost. Even now, sitting in a home that was no longer ours, hosting a dinner that I no longer controlled, he carried himself like everything still belonged to him. Like the room bent around his presence. Like people still followed his lead without realizing it. And maybe they did. For a long time, I had been part of that rhythm too. I used to anticipate his tone, adjust my words, soften my opinions before they ever left my mouth. I thought that was what harmony looked like. I thought that was what a good marriage required. I was wrong. I just don't understand, he said suddenly, breaking the quiet again, his voice smooth but edged with something colder underneath. After everything you had, why would you choose this? This. He didn't look at Daniel when he said it. He didn't need to. The word was enough. I set my glass down gently, not rushing, not hesitating, just placing it exactly where it had been before. For the same reason I left, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It just landed.
He looked at me then.
Really looked at me. And for a second, something flickered behind his expression. Not confusion, recognition. But he covered it quickly, leaning back in his chair with a small, dismissive smile. That's not an answer, he said. It is, I replied. Silence followed. Not the soft kind from earlier. This one felt sharper, more direct. Claire glanced between us, her smile fading slightly, like she wasn't sure if this was still a conversation she could control. Mom, she started, her voice cautious, you don't have to make this bigger than it is. Bigger than it is. I almost nodded, because that's exactly what I used to do. Shrink things, so they would fit into the version of reality everyone else was comfortable with. But not anymore. I'm not making anything bigger, I said calmly. I'm just not making it smaller. That seemed to stop her. Not dramatically. Just enough. Mark shifted in his seat again, this time more restless. Look, he said, exhaling as if he was trying to reset the tone. No one's attacking you. We're just trying to understand. Understand. I turned my head slightly, meeting his eyes. Are you? I asked. He hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. Because people who are truly trying to understand don't usually start with judgment. They start with listening. And no one at that table had really listened. Not yet. My ex let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if the whole thing amused him. You've always had a way of twisting things, he said, turning simple concerns into something emotional. There it was. The old script. The one I had heard so many times before that I used to believe it. That my reactions were too much. That my feelings were the problem. That if something felt wrong, it was probably me. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I let my eyes drift briefly to the Christmas tree again. The lights were still blinking in that same steady pattern. Unchanging. Unbothered. And for the first time that night, I felt something steady inside me too. Not anger. Not sadness. Just clarity. I used to think that, I said quietly. The table stilled again. I used to think I was the one making things complicated. I looked back at him, but now I realize I was just the only one paying attention. No one spoke. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her fork. Mark looked down again, and my ex didn't smile this time. Not right away, because that sentence didn't leave him much room to move. It didn't accuse. It didn't attack. It just revealed. And sometimes that's harder to respond to. Daniel shifted beside me then, not in discomfort, but in a way that felt grounding, like a quiet reminder that I wasn't sitting there alone. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel it. That steady presence. That same calm he had held all night.
It hadn't changed.
Not once. My ex finally leaned forward again, resting his hands lightly on the table. Let's be realistic, he said, his tone more controlled now. Life isn't just about feelings. It's about stability. About knowing where you stand. I watched him carefully, because for years, I had believed that too. That stability meant predictability. That knowing where you stand meant staying in place, even if that place slowly erased you. And where did I stand? I asked. The question came out softer than I expected, but it didn't lose its weight. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Just for a moment. And in that moment, I saw it. Not guilt. Not regret. But something close to discomfort. Because that question didn't have an easy answer. Not one he could say out loud. Claire quickly stepped in, her voice lighter again, almost forced. Okay, maybe we should just enjoy dinner, she said with a small laugh. It's Christmas. Christmas. The word felt distant, like something that belonged to another version of this room. Another version of us. But I nodded slightly. Not because I agreed, but because I understood. They weren't ready to sit in this. Not fully. Not yet. And maybe they didn't have to be. Not for what was coming next. Daniel reached for his glass again, taking another calm sip, his expression unchanged. And as I watched him, that same quiet feeling returned. The one I couldn't quite name earlier. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something clearer, stronger. Because for the first time that night, I realized he wasn't just sitting through this dinner. He was letting it play out. Every word, every assumption, every judgment, as if it all mattered, as if it all needed to be said, before anything else could happen. And somehow, I had the feeling we were getting very close to that moment. Claire's suggestion to just enjoy dinner hung in the air like a polite curtain drawn over something no one wanted to look at too closely. For a moment, everyone played along. Plates were adjusted. Glasses were lifted. The soft clink of silverware returned, filling the silence with something that almost sounded normal. Almost. I picked up my fork again, cutting into the turkey with slow, measured movements. The knife slid cleanly through just the way it was supposed to. Everything about the meal was exactly right. Except the people at the table. Except the truth sitting quietly between us. Across from me, Mark leaned back in his chair, stretching his arm along the backrest like he used to when he felt comfortable, when he thought he was in control of a situation. "So," he said, glancing at Daniel again, his tone lighter now but still carrying that same edge underneath. "You ever think about doing something else?" Daniel looked up. "Something else," he repeated. "Yeah," Mark continued, shrugging casually. "I mean, no offense, but that kind of work, it's not exactly something you stick with forever, right?" There it was again. The assumption. The quiet certainty that a man like Daniel was temporary, replaceable, on his way to something better, or worse, stuck where he was. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He wiped his hands slowly with his napkin, folding it neatly before placing it beside his plate. "I've thought about a lot of things," he said.
His voice was calm.
Even. The kind of tone that didn't give anything away. Mark smirked slightly. "Yeah? Like what?" Daniel held his gaze. "Like what matters," he replied. That seemed to catch him off guard. Not enough to stop him, but enough to shift something. My ex let out a small laugh under his breath. "Careful," he said, cutting in smoothly. "That's the kind of answer people give when they don't actually have options." The words were soft, but deliberate, designed to land without sounding harsh, designed to make it seem like a simple observation. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around my fork, not because I hadn't heard things like that before, but because I had, for years, in different forms, in different tones, always wrapped in something that sounded reasonable, until you looked closer. Daniel didn't react, not even a flicker. He reached for his glass again, taking another small sip. And that calm, it was starting to unsettle them, because it didn't fit, because it didn't match the role they had already assigned him. Claire shifted forward slightly, her voice softer now, almost curious. "So, what do you do all day?" she asked. "I mean, outside of work." It sounded like a genuine question, but underneath it, I could still hear it, the need to understand him within their own framework, to define him, to make sense of him. Daniel placed his glass down. "I keep things running," he said. Claire blinked. "I'm sorry." "I keep things running," he repeated. "Places. Systems. People's lives sometimes." There was a small pause. Not long. Just enough for the words to settle. Mark let out a short laugh. "Sounds important," he said, clearly not convinced. "It is," Daniel replied simply.
No emphasis.
No defense. Just truth. My ex shook his head slightly, a faint smile returning to his lips. "You have to admit," he said, turning to me now, "this is quite a change." I looked at him. "A change from what?" "From the life you had," he said. "From everything we built." Built. That word again. I let it sit for a moment before answering. "Yes," I said. "It is." He studied my face, as if trying to find something, regret, hesitation, doubt. Something that would confirm what he believed. That I had made a mistake. That I would eventually realize it. "You don't miss it?" he asked. The question was quieter this time. Less performative. But no less pointed. I thought about it. Not long. Just enough. "I miss what I thought it was," I said. That seemed to land differently. Claire looked down at her plate. Mark stopped fidgeting with his glass. And my ex didn't respond right away. Because that answer didn't give him anything to argue with. It didn't challenge him. It didn't accuse him. It just drew a line. Daniel shifted slightly beside me, reaching for another piece of bread. Still calm. Still steady. As if none of this had anything to do with proving himself. As if he didn't need to. And maybe he didn't. My ex leaned back again, exhaling slowly. Well, he said, his tone returning to something lighter, almost dismissive. I suppose time will tell.
Time.
As if this was something temporary. As if everything had a way of correcting itself back to what he considered normal. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said.
It will.
And for a moment, just a brief moment, our eyes met. Not as husband and wife. Not as two people with history. But as two people who had made very different choices. And understood exactly what those choices meant. Claire quickly reached for her glass, taking a sip, then setting it down again with a small, controlled movement. So, she said, forcing a smile once more, are you two planning anything long-term? There it was. The question beneath all the others. The real concern. Not his job. Not his background. But what he represented in my future. Daniel didn't answer. Not yet. He looked at me again. That same quiet glance. That same silent question. And for the first time that night, I felt it clearly. This wasn't just about enduring the dinner anymore. This was about what came after. What would be said. What would be revealed. And whether I was ready for it. I held his gaze for a second. Then gave the smallest nod. Barely noticeable. But enough. Because whatever they thought they understood. Whatever they believed about him. About us. They were about to find out they had been wrong all along. The question Claire asked lingered longer than the others. Not because it was louder, but because it was quieter. More careful. Are you two planning anything long-term? I could feel the shift immediately. Not in a room. In them. Because this wasn't about curiosity anymore. This was about boundaries. About how far I had really stepped away from the life they thought I still belonged to. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for my glass, letting my fingers rest against the stem before lifting it slowly. The movement gave me just enough time to think, or maybe not think at all. Sometimes silence says more. Beside me, Daniel didn't rush to fill it. He never did. That was one of the first things I noticed about him. He didn't speak to impress. He spoke when there was something worth saying. Claire smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes this time. I mean, she continued a little quicker now, it's just you've always been very structured, Mom. You don't usually make decisions like this without thinking ahead. Structured. That word almost made me smile, because for most of my life, that's exactly who I was. Predictable. Reliable. Easy to understand. Easy to manage. I have thought ahead, I said. My voice stayed even.
Calm.
The kind of calm that doesn't ask for permission. Mark leaned forward slightly. So, what does that look like? He asked. You moving in together? Getting married? Or is this just temporary? Temporary. There it was. The word they all believed but hadn't said out loud until now. I set my glass down gently, not reacting, not correcting him immediately, just letting the words sit there between us. Daniel finally spoke. We're engaged. The sentence was simple.
Clean. No build-up. No explanation.
Just truth. Claire blinked. Mark straightened in his chair. And my ex froze. Just for a second. You're what? Claire asked, her voice rising. Before she could stop it. Daniel didn't look at her. He kept his gaze steady, directed forward. We're getting married, he said. This time, slower. Clearer. No room for confusion. The room went quiet again. But not like before. This silence had weight. Shock. Calculation. I could almost hear it. Each of them adjusting, rethinking, trying to place this new piece into a picture that suddenly didn't make sense anymore. My ex let out a short laugh. Not amused. Not warm. Sharp. Of course you are, he said, shaking his head slightly. That explains a lot. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Claire leaned forward, her tone softer now, but tighter underneath. Mom, are you serious? She asked. You're actually going to marry him? I looked at her. Really looked. At the way her brows pulled together. At the way her fingers pressed lightly against the table. Not anger. Not exactly. Something closer to disbelief. Yes, I said. That was all. No long explanation.
No justification.
Just the truth. Mark exhaled sharply, leaning back again. Wow, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. That's fast.
Fast.
I almost asked him compared to what? Compared to the years I spent waiting for things to feel right. Compared to the decades I spent adjusting myself to fit someone else's expectations. But I didn't. Because this wasn't about convincing them. Not anymore. My ex leaned forward again, resting his arms on the table, his expression more controlled now. Let's not rush into something you might regret, he said. Marriage isn't a small decision. I held his gaze.
No, irrablia.
It isn't. For a moment, neither of us spoke. And in that moment, I could feel it, the shift in power that no one had acknowledged yet. Because this wasn't the same conversation we used to have. This wasn't me explaining, or defending, or asking for understanding. This was me stating something final. Claire shook her head slightly, almost to herself. I just don't get it, she said. You had everything. Stability, security, and now you're choosing this. There it was again. This. That word they kept using. Like it was something lesser. Something temporary. Something beneath what I used to have. I folded my hands together gently on the table. I'm choosing someone who showed up, I said.
No emphasis.
No drama. Just truth. Claire didn't respond. Mark looked away. And my ex didn't interrupt this time. Because there wasn't much left to say against something that simple. Daniel reached for his glass again, taking another quiet sip.
Still calm.
Still steady. As if none of this had unsettled him. And that was starting to change the room more than anything else. Because they expected tension. Defensiveness. Maybe even embarrassment. They didn't expect certainty. They didn't expect peace. And they definitely didn't expect commitment. My ex finally leaned back, exhaling slowly. Well, he said, his tone lighter again but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. I hope you know what you're doing. I nodded once.
Y do.
And for the first time that night, I meant it without hesitation. The candles flickered between us. The Christmas lights blinked softly in the background. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore, because the line had been crossed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. And as I sat there, feeling the quiet settle again, I realized something had shifted for all of us. They weren't just questioning him anymore. They were questioning me. My choices, my judgment, my future. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to make them comfortable with any of it, because whatever came next wasn't going to be explained. It was going to be shown. The word engaged didn't just sit at the table. It spread, quietly, like something no one knew how to react to but everyone felt. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Not because they were being respectful, but because they were recalculating. I could see it in the way Claire pressed her lips together, in the way Mark leaned back just a little further than before, and especially in the way my ex-husband's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in assessment. Like he was trying to figure out where this conversation had slipped out of his control. I reached for my fork again, more out of habit than hunger. The food was still warm, untouched, like most of the things on that table. Well, my ex finally said, his voice smoother now, too smooth, like he had already decided on a new angle. If that's the case, I assume you've thought about the practical side of things. Practical. There it was. The shift. From mockery to strategy. I didn't look up immediately. What do you mean? I asked. He smiled slightly. Not kindly. Just controlled. Marriage involves more than just feelings, he said.
Finance.
Assets. Responsibilities. Each word landed carefully. Deliberately. I'm sure you remember that. I did. Better than he thought. Claire leaned in a little, her tone softer, but now more focused. Mom, have you talked about that? She asked. I mean, things like property, savings, retirement, all of that matters. Mark nodded. Yeah, he added. Especially at this stage. You have to be careful. Careful. I almost smiled, because suddenly they were concerned. Not about respect. Not about how they had treated him, but about what he might take. What he might become in relation to what I had. I set my fork down again. Slowly. I've taken care of it, I said. That was enough to get their attention. Claire blinked. What does that mean? It means I've handled it, I replied. Still calm. Still even. My ex leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. And how exactly have you handled it? He asked. The tone was different now. Less mocking. More probing. Daniel finally moved. Not much. Just enough to place his glass down with a soft, deliberate motion. Then he spoke. We've both made arrangements, he said. Simple. Direct. That seemed to shift something again. My ex looked at him now, not dismissively, not amused, but with a level of attention he hadn't given him before. What kind of arrangements? He asked. Daniel met his gaze. The kind that make things clear.
No elaboration. No detail.
Just enough. And that unsettled them, because they wanted specifics. Numbers. Structures. Something they could evaluate. Something they could control. Claire let out a small breath. I just think it's important to protect yourself, she said, turning back to me. You've worked hard your whole life. You shouldn't risk that. Risk. There. It was again. I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw it. Not just judgment. Fear. Not fear for me. Fear of losing what they believed was still tied to them. I'm not risking anything, I said. Quiet. Steady. Mark frowned slightly. How can you be sure? He asked. I held his gaze. Because I finally understand what I'm protecting. That seemed to stop him. Not completely, but enough. My ex exhaled slowly, leaning back again, though this time it didn't feel as relaxed. Well, he said, I hope you've been thorough. I nodded once. I have. There was a pause. And then, Daniel spoke again. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to shift the weight in the room. We've also signed an agreement. Claire's eyes widened slightly. An agreement? Daniel nodded. A prenuptial agreement. That landed. Heavier than the word engaged. Because this wasn't emotion. This was structure. Planning. Control. Mark leaned forward again. And you're okay with that? He asked, looking at me now. I didn't hesitate. Yes.
No explanation. No hesitation.
Just the truth. Claire shook her head slightly, almost confused. But why? She asked. I mean, if you trust each other. We do, I said. Then I let a small pause sit between us. And that's exactly why we made it clear. Silence followed. A different kind this time. Less judgment. More uncertainty. Because this didn't fit their narrative anymore. This wasn't a reckless decision. This wasn't someone being taken advantage of. This was deliberate. Thought out. Protected. My ex studied Daniel again, more carefully now. And what does this agreement say? He asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He glanced at me. Just briefly. Then back at him. It says exactly what it needs to, he replied. That wasn't the answer they wanted. But it was the only one they were going to get. Claire leaned back slowly. Mark didn't speak. And for the first time that night, my ex didn't push further. Because something had changed. Not everything, but enough. The dynamic had shifted. Slightly. Quietly. But unmistakably. They weren't just looking at Daniel as a man they could dismiss anymore. They were starting to realize. He wasn't unprepared. He wasn't. Unaware. And he definitely wasn't out of place. I reached for my glass again, taking a slow sip. The room felt different now. Still tense. Still layered. But no longer one-sided. Because for the first time since we sat down, they weren't the only ones asking questions. And as I set my glass back down, watching their expressions carefully, I could see it. That small crack forming in the certainty they had walked in with. And I knew we were getting closer. The word agreement lingered longer than anything else that had been said that night. Not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't fit the story they had already written in their heads. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my ex-husband leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers resting lightly against the table as if he was approaching something he hadn't fully anticipated. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "That's interesting." Interesting. A word people use when they don't know whether they've lost control of a situation or are about to. Claire glanced at him, then back at me. "So you've already signed everything?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes."
No hesitación. No explanación.
Just certainty. Mark frowned slightly. "That was quick," he said. "I mean, you've only known each other for what?" "Long enough," Daniel said calmly, cutting in before he could finish. The room stilled again. Not sharply, but noticeably. Because that was the first time Daniel had interrupted anyone. And he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't pushed. He had simply stopped the narrative before it could continue. Mark leaned back again, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Right," he said under his breath. My ex studied Daniel more carefully now. Not with amusement. Not with dismissal. But with something closer to calculation. "And this agreement," he continued. "Was it your idea?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He reached for his glass, taking a small, steady sip before setting it back down in the exact same spot. Then he looked up. "It was mutual," he said. Simple.
Clear.
But something about the way he said it shifted the weight of the room again. Because that wasn't the answer of someone being led. That was the answer of someone who decided. Claire crossed her arms lightly, her expression more guarded now. "I just don't understand why you'd even need one," she said. "If everything is so stable." Stable. That word again. But this time, it sounded different. Less confident. More uncertain. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair. Not in discomfort, but in a way that felt grounded. Like he had no reason to lean forward to prove anything. "Because clarity matters," he said. Claire blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," Daniel continued, his tone even, "that when people know exactly where they stand, there's less room for misunderstanding." The sentence landed quietly, but it carried something heavier underneath. Not directed, not accusatory, but close enough that it made everyone at the table think. Mark let out a short breath. "Sounds like you've dealt with this before," he said. Daniel met his eyes. "I have."
No elaboración.
No story.
Just that.
And that was enough to shift things again. Because now there was history. Not the kind they could see. Not the kind they could measure. But something real. My ex tapped his fingers lightly against the table. Once, twice, then stopped. "And what exactly do you bring into this arrangement?" he asked. The question was smooth. Controlled. But this time, it wasn't disguised. It was direct. The room tightened. Claire looked at him quickly. "Dad," but he didn't stop. "I'm just asking," he said calmly. "If we're talking about clarity, then let's be clear." There it was. Not mockery. Not jokes. Something sharper. Something more intentional. I felt my fingers still against my lap. Waiting. Watching. Daniel didn't move right away. He didn't react to the tone. He didn't react to the implication. He simply sat there for a moment, as if deciding whether the question deserved an answer. Then he spoke. "I bring exactly what's mine," he said. The words were simple, but the way he said them, there was something in it. Something steady. Something unshaken. My ex tilted his head slightly. And what would that be? This time, Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, not rushed, not defensive, just intentional. Everyone noticed. Claire's eyes followed the motion. Mark leaned forward slightly, without realizing it. Even my ex went still. Daniel pulled out his phone. Not dramatically. Just enough to place it gently on the table beside his plate. The screen lit up briefly. A notification.
A name.
I didn't look directly at it, but I saw the reflection in the glass near me. Harrison Group, it read. The name hung there. Quiet. Unexplained. But not unnoticed. My ex's expression changed. Not much. Just a fraction.
But I saw it.
Recognition.
Quick.
Controlled. gone just as fast as it appeared. Daniel didn't comment on it. He didn't turn the phone toward anyone. He didn't explain. He simply let it sit there. Then he looked back up.
Calm. Composed.
And clarity, he added softly, goes both ways. No one spoke. Because that sentence didn't just answer the question. It redirected it. Claire looked between them, her expression shifting. Mark leaned back again, slower this time. And my ex, for the first time that night, didn't have a response ready. The room felt different now. Not louder. Not more tense. But altered. Like something had just been introduced that didn't belong to the version of the story they had built. I reached for my glass again, taking a slow sip, letting the silence settle. Because this silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of questions they hadn't asked yet. Full of answers they weren't ready to hear. And as I set my glass back down, watching them carefully, I realized something had shifted again. Not just in how they saw Daniel, but in how they were beginning to see themselves. And this time, they weren't laughing anymore. The name on Daniel's phone didn't need to be explained. That was the unsettling part.
It just sat there.
Quiet.
Ordinary.
But heavy in a way that shifted everything around it. No one reached for it. No one asked. But everyone saw it. I could tell by the way Claire's fingers tightened slightly around her glass, by the way Mark stopped moving altogether, and especially by the way my ex-husband's posture changed, just enough to notice, not enough to admit. Recognition has a way of doing that. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in small, involuntary moments. Daniel didn't touch the phone again. He didn't turn it. He didn't explain. He simply left it there like it didn't matter. And somehow, that made it matter more. My ex cleared his throat quietly, sitting back in his chair as if he needed to reset the tone of the room. Well, he said, his voice controlled again, but thinner now, stretched over something less certain. We all get emails. Emails. I almost smiled, because that wasn't what it was. And he knew it, but he needed it to be something smaller. Something manageable. Daniel didn't respond. He just reached for his fork again, cutting into his food with the same steady rhythm as before.
No rush. No hesitation.
As if nothing had changed. But everything had. Claire shifted in her seat, her voice softer now. Harrison Group, she said quietly, almost to herself. Isn't that, she stopped. Not because she didn't know, but because she wasn't sure if she should say it out loud. Mark looked at her quickly. What? He asked. She hesitated for a second, then shook her head. Nothing, she said. I just thought I recognized the name. Recognized. Another careful word. Another step away from certainty. My ex picked up his glass again, taking a slower sip this time. Longer. More deliberate. Buying time. And I saw it. That small shift. That crack. Because for the first time that night, he wasn't leading the conversation. He was reacting to it. Daniel placed his fork down again.
Gently.
Exactly where it had been before. Then he looked at my ex. Not aggressively. Not challengingly. Just directly.
You do, he said.
2 words.
Calm. Certain.
The room stilled. My ex didn't respond immediately. But his eyes didn't leave Daniel this time. Not like before. Not with dismissal. With attention. Real attention. I've come across a lot of names, he said finally. That doesn't mean anything. Daniel nodded slightly. You've come across this one more than once.
No accusation.
No pressure. Just a statement. Claire looked between them again, her expression tightening. Wait, she said, her voice sharper now. What are we talking about? Mark leaned forward slightly. Yeah, what is this? For the first time, the control slipped. Just a little. Because now, they weren't sure what they were missing. Daniel didn't rush to answer. He reached for his glass again, taking a small sip before setting it down. Then he spoke. Your father knows, he said. That was enough. Claire turned to him immediately.
Dad.
My ex didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Daniel. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because whatever he said next mattered. More than anything else he had said all night. Finally, he exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with a quiet, controlled movement. It's a private equity group, he said. The words were simple, but the way he said them, careful, measured. Claire blinked. Okay, and Mark frowned. What does that have to do with? He stopped. Mid-sentence. Because something clicked. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. My ex leaned back slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, his expression no longer amused. Large acquisitions, he added quietly. Now Claire's eyes widened. Wait, she looked at Daniel again. Really looked this time. Not at his suit. Not at his hands. At him. Trying to reconcile something that didn't match. That company just, she started then stopped again. Because she didn't finish the thought.
She didn't need to.
We all knew. Daniel didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He simply sat there.
Calm.
Unmoved. And that silence said more than anything else could have. Mark leaned back slowly. Hold on, he said, his voice lower now. Are you saying... Daniel didn't let him finish. I'm not saying anything, he replied. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because he didn't need to say it. They were already putting it together.
Piece by piece.
Word by word. My ex's jaw tightened slightly. Just enough to notice. But not enough to admit. Because now, the conversation wasn't about a janitor anymore. It wasn't about class. Or choices. Or disappointment. It was about something else entirely. Something they hadn't prepared for. Something they hadn't considered.
Iset.
There quietly, watching it unfold. Not surprised. Not shocked. Just aware. Because I had known. Not everything. But enough. Enough to understand the difference between what they saw and what was actually in front of them. Claire leaned back slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. This doesn't make sense, no.
It didn't. Not to them.
Because their version of reality had been built on assumptions. And assumptions don't hold up well when the truth starts showing through. Daniel glanced at me then, just briefly. The same calm look. The same quiet understanding. And, in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about proving anything. Not for him. Not for me. This was about letting them see.
Clearly.
Without interruption. Without explanation. Exactly who they had been talking to. And as the silence stretched across the table, longer now. Heavier now, I could feel it. We weren't at the beginning of something anymore. We were right on the edge of it. And whatever came next was going to change everything they thought they knew. No one finished their sentence. That was the strange part. Everyone almost said something, and then stopped. Like the truth was right there, just out of reach, but too dangerous to say out loud without being completely sure. Mark leaned forward again, slower this time. Are you saying you work for them? He asked. His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It wasn't casual. It was careful, measured. Daniel looked at him, then shook his head slightly. I didn't say that. Not defensive. Not evasive. Just precise. Claire frowned, trying to follow. Then what are you saying? She asked. Daniel didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to my ex. Not aggressively. Not challengingly. But directly. Like the answer wasn't meant for everyone at the table. Just for him. You reviewed one of our proposals last year, Daniel said. The sentence was calm. Flat. But it landed harder than anything else that night. My ex didn't react right away.
But I saw it.
That flicker. Recognition turning into certainty. And then something else. Mark looked between them. Dad, he said. Claire's voice came quicker. What proposal? My ex exhaled. Slowly. Longer this time. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Daniel. The North Ridge deal, he said. Quiet. Controlled. And that was the moment everything locked into place. Claire's hand tightened around her glass. Wait, that deal fell through, she said. You said the buyers pulled out. My ex didn't respond. Not immediately. Because now, the version of the story he had told them was sitting right next to the reality. And they didn't match. Daniel leaned back slightly.
Still calm.
Still composed. They didn't pull out, he said. Silence. They walked away, he added. Same tone. Same control. But sharper now. More defined. Mark frowned. What's the difference? He asked. Daniel looked at him. The difference, he said, is who had the leverage. That was it. No raised voice.
No explanation.
Just a line that changed the direction of the entire conversation. Claire shook her head slowly. I don't understand, she whispered, but I could see it. She was starting to.
Piece by piece.
My ex finally leaned forward again, resting both hands flat on the table. This time, he didn't pretend. He didn't soften his tone. He didn't smile. What are you implying? He asked. There it was.
Direct.
No more games. Daniel met his gaze. I'm not implying anything, he said. I'm reminding you. The room went still. Completely still. Because that wasn't a guess. That wasn't speculation. That was certainty. Mark looked at his father again. Dad, what is he talking about? He asked. Claire's voice followed, tighter now. Why does he know about your deals? My ex didn't answer them. He couldn't. Not without confirming something he hadn't planned to reveal. Instead, he focused on Daniel. Who are you? He asked. The question came out low, controlled. But this time, it wasn't mocking. It wasn't dismissive. It was real. Daniel didn't rush to answer. He reached for his glass one more time, taking a slow sip before setting it down. Then he spoke. I'm the one who decided not to move forward, he said. The words were simple, but the impact immediate. Claire inhaled sharply. Mark sat back like something had physically pushed him. And my ex didn't move at all. Not for a full
second.
Because that sentence didn't just shift the conversation. It rewrote it. You, Mark said, his voice almost disbelieving. You made that call? Daniel didn't look at him. Yes.
No explanation.
No expansion. Just the truth. Claire's eyes moved quickly between them. But that deal was worth. She stopped. Because she didn't need to finish. Everyone at that table knew what it was worth. And suddenly, the word janitor didn't sound the same anymore. My ex leaned back slowly. Not in control. Not relaxed. Just recalibrating. You expect me to believe that? He said. But his voice had changed. There was no confidence in it. Only resistance. Daniel held his gaze. I don't expect anything, he replied. I'm just answering your question. Silence again. But this time no one tried to fill it. Because there was nothing left to cover it with.
No jokes.
No polite words.
No deflection.
Just truth. Sitting there. Unavoidable. Claire looked down at her plate, then back up at Daniel. Her expression wasn't mocking anymore. It wasn't dismissive. It was uncertain. You're not a janitor, she said quietly. It wasn't even a question. Daniel gave a small, almost unnoticeable smile. I manage properties, he said. The same words as before. But now they meant something completely different. Mark let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair again. This doesn't make any sense, he muttered. But it did. It just didn't match what they wanted to believe. I sat there quietly, watching them, watching the shift, watching the weight of their own assumptions settle back onto them. Because no one had forced them to say anything. No one had pushed them to judge. They had done that on their own. And now they were sitting with it. My ex's jaw tightened again. He looked at Daniel like he was trying to find something, some weakness, some inconsistency, something he could still hold on to. But there wasn't anything left to grab, because the conversation had already moved past that point. And for the first time that night, he didn't have the upper hand. Not in tone, not in control, not in truth. The candles flickered softly between us. The Christmas lights continued their quiet rhythm in the background. Everything looked the same, but the room felt completely different. Because now, they weren't looking down at Daniel anymore. They were looking at him, trying to understand how they hadn't seen it. And as the silence stretched again, I realized something. We weren't building toward a reveal anymore. That had already happened. Now, they just had to sit with it. No one reached for their food anymore. The plates were still full. The candles still burned. But the dinner was over. Not officially. No one had said it. But everyone at that table knew it. Claire was the first to move. Not much. Just her hand pulling back from her glass, her fingers curling slightly like she didn't quite know where to place them anymore. So, you own part of that company? She asked. Her voice was quieter now. Careful. Daniel didn't correct her. He didn't confirm it either. I'm involved in the decisions, he said. The same calm tone. The same precision. But now, every word carried weight. Mark let out a slow breath, leaning back again, his earlier confidence completely gone. And, you just didn't say anything? He asked. Daniel glanced at him briefly. No one asked the right question, he replied. That landed. Harder than anything else. Because it wasn't just an answer. It was a mirror. My ex let out a short, dry laugh, but it didn't hold. Not like before. That's convenient, he said. But there was no bite left in it.
No certainty.
Just resistance. Daniel didn't react.
He didn't need to.
Because for the first time that night, the truth wasn't something he had to defend. It was something they had to process. Claire shook her head slowly. I just don't understand why you wouldn't say anything sooner, she said. Why let us think? She stopped. Because she hurt herself. Because she realized what she was about to admit. Why let us think he was beneath us? Daniel answered anyway. Because what you thought mattered more than what I said.
Silence.
Real silence. Not the kind you fill. The kind that fills you. Mark looked down at the table, his jaw tightening. That's not fair, he muttered. Daniel tilted his head slightly. No, he said. It's accurate.
No anger. No.
Accusation. Just truth. And truth doesn't argue. My ex shifted forward again, but this time it felt different. Less controlled. Less certain. You're making this into something it isn't, he said. We were just evaluating, Daniel finished. Not cutting him off harshly. Just finishing the sentence he didn't want to say. My ex didn't respond. Because there wasn't a better word.
Claire looked at me then.
For the first time that night, not past me, not around me. At me. Mom, she said softly. You knew? I held her gaze. Yes. That was all. Her expression shifted again. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something deeper. Because now it wasn't just about Daniel.
It was about me.
What I had chosen. What I had allowed. You let this happen? She asked. I didn't rush to answer. I let the question sit. Let it settle into the space between us. Then I spoke. I let you show me who you are, I said. The words were quiet, but they didn't need to be loud.
Claire blinked.
Mark looked up. My ex didn't move. Because that sentence didn't attack. It didn't accuse. It just closed something. A realization. A line. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Okay, he said almost to himself. Okay, this is getting blown out of proportion. Out of proportion. That was always the fallback. When things got too real. When the truth didn't feel comfortable anymore. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Still composed. Still steady. It's exactly in proportion, he said. Mark looked at him, frustration starting to surface again. It was just a joke, he said. We didn't mean anything by it. Daniel met his eyes. You meant exactly what you said.
No hesitation. No softness.
Just clarity. Mark didn't respond. Because there was nothing to argue with. Claire looked down at her plate again. Her voice came out quieter this time. We didn't know, I watched her. Carefully. You didn't ask, I said. That was the difference. Not knowledge. Not information.
Choice.
My ex finally leaned back fully, his posture no longer composed, just still. This is unnecessary, he said. We're turning a simple dinner into a moment you didn't expect, Daniel said. That stopped him. Completely. Because that was the truth. This wasn't complicated. It wasn't dramatic. It was just unexpected. And they hadn't prepared for it. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the space between everyone had closed in. The Christmas lights still blinked. The music still played softly in the background. But none of it reached the table anymore. Because something else had taken over. Something quieter. Heavier. More real. I reached for my napkin, folding it slowly in my hands. Not nervous. Not distracted. Just finished. Because there was nothing left to say. Not really. They had seen enough. Heard enough. Felt enough. Daniel stood first. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just a simple movement.
Calm.
Controlled. Like he had already decided. I looked up at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I stood with him. Slowly. The chair moved softly against the floor. No one stopped us. No one spoke. Because they didn't know what to say. And maybe, for the first time that night, they understood something. Respect isn't something you explain. It's something people show you, or something they lose. I looked at the table one last time. At the plates, the glasses, the people I used to call my whole world. Then I spoke. Quietly. Enjoy your dinner. And that was it.
No anger.
No raised voice. No scene. Just an ending. Daniel reached for my hand. I let him. And, together, we walked away from the table. Not because we had to, but because we chose to. And this time, there was nothing left behind that I wanted to take with me. The hallway felt quieter than the dining room. Not because it was empty, but because it was honest. No laughter forced to sound natural. No words carefully shaped to hide what they really meant. Just the soft sound of our footsteps against the wooden floor and the faint music still playing behind us, muffled now, distant. Daniel didn't let go of my hand. He didn't tighten it either. He just held it. Steady. The way he always did. We walked past the living room, past the Christmas tree I had once spent hours decorating. The lights still blinked in their quiet rhythm, just like they had all night. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. I paused near the doorway, not because I wasn't ready to leave, but because I needed one moment, just one, to look back. The dining room was still visible from where I stood. Claire was sitting still, her posture stiff, her hands folded in front of her plate, like she didn't know what to do with them anymore. Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring down, not at his food, but at something else entirely. And my ex, he hadn't moved. Not since we stood up. He was still sitting there, his chair slightly pushed back, his glass untouched, his expression fixed somewhere between control and something he couldn't quite hide. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Something closer to realization. The kind that comes too late to change anything. I didn't feel satisfaction. That surprised me. I thought I might. After everything that had been said. After the way they had laughed. After the years of being overlooked, adjusted, reduced to something smaller, so the rest of them could feel larger. But standing there, I didn't feel any of that. I felt clear. Daniel shifted slightly beside me, his presence grounding, steady as always. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Yes. And this time, I meant it in a way I hadn't in a long time. Because being okay didn't mean everything was perfect. It meant I wasn't questioning myself anymore. Behind us, a chair moved.
Soft.
Careful, Mom. Claire's voice. Not loud, not confident, just uncertain. I turned.
Slowly.
Not rushing, not avoiding. She stood at the edge of the dining room now, her eyes searching mine in a way they hadn't all night. Not judging, not measuring, looking. "Wait," she said. One word. But it carried everything she hadn't said before. Mark stood too, a step behind her. And my ex remained seated, watching. Claire took a small step forward. I didn't mean she started then stopped. Because she didn't know how to finish it. Didn't mean what? Didn't mean to laugh? Didn't mean to judge? Didn't mean to see him as less? The words didn't come. And for once, I didn't help her. I just stood there, waiting. She swallowed. "We didn't know," she said finally. That again. The same sentence. But this time it sounded different. Less like a defense. More like a realization. I held her gaze.
"You didn't need to know," I said. Quiet. Steady.
Claire frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I continued, "you had everything you needed to treat someone with respect and you chose not to."
No anger. No accusation.
Just truth. Mark exhaled slowly behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Okay, but we didn't think." "I know," I said. And that stopped him. Because that was the point. They didn't think. Not about him.
Not about me.
Not about what their words meant. My ex finally stood. Slowly. Deliberately. The same controlled movements he had used his entire life. But something about it felt different now. Less certain. He stepped forward just enough to be heard. You're overreacting, he said. The words came out quieter than usual, but they were the same. The same script. The same attempt to shrink something that didn't fit his version of reality. I looked at him. Really looked. And, for the first time, I didn't feel the need to respond to that version of him. I'm not reacting at all, I said.
Calm.
Even.
I'm deciding.
That was it. That was the difference. Claire's eyes filled slightly. Not with tears, but with something close to it. Mom, we're your family, she said. I nodded. You are.
No hesitación. No denial.
But I didn't soften it. I didn't bend it into something comforting. Because family isn't just a title. It's a way people show up. And tonight they had shown up exactly as they were. Daniel shifted his hand slightly in mine. Not pulling. Not guiding. Just there. And that was enough. Mark took a small step forward. We can fix this, he said. I looked at him. At the man he had become. At the distance that had grown between us over years, not moments. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, I said. Quiet. Final. Silence followed. No one argued. No one interrupted. Because they could feel it. That this wasn't a discussion anymore. It wasn't something to negotiate. It was something that had already been decided. I glanced at the table one last time. The untouched food. The flickering candles. The place where everything had finally surfaced. Then I looked back at them. I hope you have a good night, I said. Simple. Polite. Complete.
No anger. No bitterness.
Just distance. Daniel squeezed my hand slightly. And this time, I didn't look back again. We walked toward the door together. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. The way you walk when you're not running from something, but leaving it behind. And as the door opened, letting in the cold night air, one thought settled quietly in my mind. Some endings don't need closure. They just need clarity. And for the first time in years, I finally had it. The cold air outside felt sharper than I expected. Not harsh. Not uncomfortable. Just real. It filled my lungs in a way the air inside hadn't all night.
Clean. Honest.
I stepped down from the porch slowly, Daniel's hand still in mine, steady as always. Behind us, the door remained open for a moment longer than necessary, like something unfinished was still standing in that doorway. Then it closed. Softly.
No slam.
No final sound. Just quiet. We walked toward the car in silence, the faint crunch of gravel beneath our shoes the only thing breaking it. The neighborhood was calm, decorated with lights that blinked in soft colors across rooftops and windows. Everything looked peaceful, like every other Christmas night. But I didn't feel like I was walking away from something ruined. I felt like I was walking away from something revealed. Daniel opened the passenger door for me, the same way he always did, no matter where we were, no matter who was watching. I paused for a second before getting in, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the door. Thank you, I said. He looked at me, not surprised, not questioning, just present.
For what? He asked.
I smiled slightly. For not saying anything until it mattered. He nodded once. I didn't need to, he said. You saw everything.
And he was right.
That was the difference. He didn't try to convince me. He didn't try to prove himself. He let the truth exist long enough for everyone else to reveal themselves around it. I got into the car, settling into the seat as he closed the door gently behind me. The engine started with a quiet hum. Warm air slowly filled the space.
But I
didn't reach for the heater.
Not yet.
I just sat there, looking out through the windshield at the house I had once called home. The lights were still on, the trees still glowing faintly through the window. From the outside, nothing looked broken. Nothing looked different. But I knew better. Because I had lived inside that version of perfect for years. The version where things looked right, but never felt right. Daniel pulled out of the driveway slowly.
No ruse.
No need to escape. Just a quiet departure. We drove in silence for a few minutes. Not uncomfortable. Not empty. Just settled. I rested my hands in my lap, noticing how still they felt.
No tensión. No hesitación. No second-guessing.
And that surprised me. Because for so long, Every decision I made had come with a question attached to it. Is this right? Will this upset someone? Am I asking for too much? But tonight, there were no questions. Only answers. Daniel glanced at me briefly. You didn't look back, he said. It wasn't a question, just an observation. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. Another pause. Do you want to? He asked. I thought about it. Not long. Just enough. Then I smiled. No, I said again. And I meant it, because looking back would have meant I was still searching for something there. Something I had lost. Something I wanted returned. But I wasn't. What I had been looking for wasn't at that table. It never was. We stopped at a red light. The glow from the signal reflected softly across the windshield, casting a quiet red hue inside the car. I watched it for a moment. Then I spoke. They laughed, I said. Not bitter. Not emotional. Just stating it. Daniel nodded. They did. I let the silence sit for a second before continuing. I used to think that would break me, I said. The light turned green. The car moved forward. But it didn't. Daniel didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He just listened. I continued slowly. It would have to a few years ago. That felt true. Back when I needed their approval. Back when I measured my worth by how comfortable I made other people feel. Back when silence meant I had done something wrong. But not anymore. Tonight, I said, looking ahead, it just showed me where I don't belong.
No anger. No sadness.
Just clarity. Daniel's hand moved slightly, resting over mine.
Warm. Steady.
You belong where you're respected, he said. I nodded. I know. And that was the difference. Not hope. Not belief. Knowing. The road stretched out ahead of us, quiet and open, lined with houses glowing softly in the distance. Somewhere behind us, that dinner was still sitting at that table. The unfinished plates. The unspoken words. The realization settling in for them, piece by piece. But it wasn't mine anymore. I had taken what I needed from it, the truth, and left the rest behind. After a while, I leaned back into the seat, letting out a slow breath I didn't realize I had been holding for years. Not just tonight. Years. Daniel glanced at me again. You're lighter, he said. I smiled faintly. I am. And it wasn't because anything had been fixed. It wasn't because anyone had apologized. It wasn't because the past had changed. It was because I finally stopped trying to carry it. The car moved steadily through the night, the sound of the road soft beneath us. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was moving forward, not into something uncertain, not into something risky, but into something simple, something honest, something real. I looked at Daniel, at the man they had called trash, at the man who had sat quietly while they judged him, at the man who never needed to prove anything because he already knew who he was. And I realized that night wasn't about revealing him. It was about revealing them. And maybe it was also about revealing me, the version of me that no longer waits to be chosen, no longer stays to be understood, no longer shrinks to be accepted, the version of me that simply stands, chooses, walks away when it's time, and doesn't look back. The road ahead was quiet, open, steady, and as the lights of the city stretched out in front of us, I finally understood something I should have known long ago. Respect isn't given to you because of where you've been. It's reflected in who you choose to stand beside and who you're willing to walk away from. And this time, I chose right.